absolute power. The power to make war or peace, to suppress ideas, to transform society. This was the power of the Russian Tsar. In the Age of Enlightenment, the call for liberty fueled revolution around the world. But in Russia, the power of the crown crushed the people's will for change. By the 20th century, the Russian people were no longer willing to serve an absolute monarch, and the land of the Tsars faced the fires of revolution. On a November evening in 1741, Peter the Great's daughter, Elizaveta Petrovna Romanova, dressed for a night to remember. Like her father, the Grand Duchess Elizabeth loved dramatic surprises. Tonight, she'd planned a showstopper, a bold grab for power over the largest empire on Earth.
Elizabeth built upon the popularity she had with the guards, and when her carriage ran through the streets of St. Petersburg, there would often be cries, "Elizabeth, you are our true empress. You must take the throne."
Elizabeth's father, the legendary Tsar Peter, had transformed Russia from an isolated borderland into an 18th century superpower. Russian arms controlled the balance of power across northern Europe and Western Asia, and had carried the empire east to the Pacific. But on his deathbed, Peter plunged Russia into turmoil when he died without naming an heir to the throne. Some saw Peter's daughter Elizabeth as his natural successor, but the late Tsar's enemies had their own designs on the crown. And at 15, Elizabeth was not ready to fight for power in the ruthless Russian court. And so Elizabeth watched for 16 years as rival factions dragged the Romanov dynasty to the brink of extinction. First her mother, then a nephew, then an estranged cousin took the throne. Hard living, smallpox, death claimed them all. Finally, a distant cousin, a 2-month-old baby boy with hardly a drop of Tsar Peter's blood, was proclaimed Emperor of Russia.
Elizabeth is well aware that her family once were the controllers of the throne, and so she feels some threat that if she doesn't make a play for power, she may suffer even worse consequences. She might be sent to a convent.
Now, with an infant on the imperial throne, Elizabeth sensed opportunity and took action. On November 25, 1741, Peter the Great's daughter donned a royal guardsman's uniform, rallied her father's most loyal officers, and led her forces in a swift and bloodless palace coup. Her helpless rival, the infant Tsar, was locked away for the rest of his unfortunate life. At 32, Elizabeth seized the crown and her birthright as empress.
She was brilliant in her transfer of power. She immediately came out with an accession manifesto that said, "I will rule in the spirit of my father and my mother. I will be a reformer. I am a Russian. I will keep Russian interests at heart." We have finally gotten rid of this treasonous group who had occupied the throne and robbed Russia of its riches.
Elizabeth wasted no time naming her own heir. Childless herself, in 1742, the new empress chose her nephew, German-born Peter Ulrich, next in line for the throne.
He was born under the luckiest of stars. The kid, at the moment of birth, could have been the Grand Duke of Holstein, the King of Sweden, or the Emperor of Russia. Now, that's a very good bloodline.
At the age of 14, the lucky princeling left his beloved German homeland of Holstein to join the Russian court. There was just one problem. The young Tsar-to-be, Peter III, hated Russia and all things Russian.
He was Empress Elizabeth's nephew, and he was designated by her to be the heir. He was truly a foolish, stupid character.
He was immature. He had a shrill, irritating voice and thought that the height of wit was to stick his tongue out.
Peter's dubious character and open scorn for Russia made him a less than perfect candidate for the throne. To protect the empire and the Romanov dynasty, Elizabeth wanted an heir she could trust, a child of Peter III, but bred from birth to rule and love Russia. What she needed now was a healthy young princess to breed her a baby Tsarevich. And so, in the winter of 1744, the Empress summoned a second young German to her palace, Sophia of Anhalt-Zerbst. It was the beginning of a 50-year odyssey, which would transform the daughter of impoverished aristocrats into the most powerful woman on earth, the Empress Catherine the Great.
Catherine realized that this was her great opportunity, that she was from a rather low-ranking German princely family, and that her future in Russia was a lot more promising than anything that she could find in Germany.
Not long after she arrived, the 15-year-old girl was baptized into the Russian Orthodox Church and rechristened Catherine in honor of Elizabeth's own mother. From the start, Catherine eagerly embraced her adopted homeland. The only thing Catherine didn't love about Russia was her fiancé, the German-born heir to the Russian throne, Grand Duke Peter III. The fact that Peter seemed dim-witted and childish didn't help the romance.
Peter's passions were his toy soldiers. He would bring them to bed with them and put them through their maneuvers, and she had to play along.
He would kind of drill her and march her around and this kind of thing. She got tired of that.
She walked in one day to find a rat hanging from a rope, and he explained to her that the rat had committed treason and that he was paying the penalty. So this is what she was dealing with in terms of a husband, an imbecile.
Fireworks lit the skies on the night of the royal wedding. In the bridal bed, fireworks were out of the question. In the arena of court politics, producing an heir to the throne would soon be a matter of survival. Under the circumstances, delivering on that job might take Catherine more time than expected, and perhaps a little extramarital assistance. In 1753, after 8 years of marriage, the Grand Duchess Catherine, wife of the heir to the Russian throne, finally lost her virginity, but not to her husband, the Grand Duke Peter. The Empress Elizabeth expected Catherine to produce the next generation of Romanovs. With her husband unwilling or unable to help, the Grand Duchess followed the advice of her friends and gave her heart and body to a willing courtier, Serge Saltykov.
She was encouraged to have this affair with Serge Saltykov, and this apparently was an attempt to get both Peter and Catherine more at home with matters sexual, and then to get them together to produce the promised heir.
With Peter off doing his thing, leaving her lonely and abandoned, the one role that she was designated to do, she wasn't able to do, which was reproduce. And that put her in a very threatening position.
Adultery could be a dangerous game, but for Catherine, nothing was more risky than remaining childless. Soon she delivered what the Empress required, a baby. Paul. Historians still debate whether the royal heir was fathered by Catherine's husband or her lover. Having performed her duty, Catherine was cast aside, discarded by her husband, the Empress, and their circles at court. But the Grand Duchess had already developed an appetite for power.
Catherine became a student of silent observation. And in doing that, she learned all the customs of Russia, the language. She even converted to the Russian Orthodox Church as a way of incorporating herself into the system.
She learned Russian politics. She liked politics. She read widely to keep herself abreast of European thinking. So for all of these reasons, Catherine became a very attractive figure at court.
Catherine had been bold since childhood, and now with a royal heir to her credit, she waded into the political fray. At one dinner, she warned the French ambassador to mind her ambitions.
There never was a woman bolder than I. I have unbridled audacity.
Peter and Catherine drifted from distant relations to open hostility. The Tsar-to-be warned that once he succeeded Elizabeth on the throne, he might lock his wife in a convent or dispose of her entirely. But while her husband threatened, Catherine built defenses and planned for the future. She forged alliances with generals and politicians throughout the empire and across Europe. In 1758, Catherine's growing web of influence caught the attention of the Empress Elizabeth. To cover her tracks, Catherine burned her journals and correspondence. Then she met the Tsarina for a private conference to discuss Catherine's loyalty and Elizabeth's unsatisfactory heir, Peter.
It certainly had been planted in Catherine's mind that she might like to be empress in her own right. So there was plotting, and people who recognized Peter as being incompetent, feared despotic tendencies in his character, rallied around Catherine.
While Peter and Catherine sparred, the Empress Elizabeth's armies marched into battle. The empire's enemy, Prussia, and its warrior king, Frederick the Great, a man the German-born Grand Duke Peter had idolized all his life. Prussian conquests had shaken Europe's balance of power. Elizabeth had joined an alliance to quash Frederick's upstart Germanic Empire. By 1761, Russian forces had gained the upper hand. In St. Petersburg, heroes from the front returned to adoring throngs. The greatest hero of them all, the guardsman Grigory Orlov, swept the Grand Duchess Catherine off her feet.
Grigory Orlov was the second of the 5 Orlov brothers, all of whom were handsome, all of whom were reckless, all of whom were dashing. And Catherine fell in love with the said Gregory Orlov, he was the one who helped organize the guards to support her bid for the throne.
Catherine and the Orlov brothers dubbed Peter the Monster. They despised his childish ways and Prussian fixation. As the year ended, events came to a head. At the front, the Russian army had overrun Berlin. Frederick the Great was on his knees. His German kingdom was about to be wiped off the map. At the palace, Grand Duke Peter was in despair at the impending defeat of his beloved Prussia, while his Aunt Elizabeth was poised for victory. Then came Christmas Day. Elizaveta Petrovna Romanova, 52 years old, sole surviving child of Peter the Great, Tsarina and Empress of Russia, fell dead.
Elizabeth really had created the modern Russian European-type court. European court was unthinkable without women, and women had not been at all prominent at the Muscovite court.
In many ways, Empress Elizabeth, despite her flaws, was a role model for Catherine that a woman can be in charge and have power.
The Empress's nephew and heir to the throne, the German princeling Peter III, danced for glee at Elizabeth's funeral. In his first act as Tsar, Peter declared peace with Prussia, sparing his hero Frederick from annihilation and infuriating the entire Russian army. And the new Tsar wouldn't stop there. He ordered the officer corps out of the Russian green uniforms he hated and dressed them in Prussian blue. He stripped the icons out of the Russian Orthodox Church he feared and ordered the priests to dress like German Lutheran ministers. And in a final foolhardy adventure, Peter ordered up an invasion force to claim the German homeland he had left 20 years before, the distant Duchy of Holstein. One night, Tsar Peter toasted his impending crusade. When his wife Catherine failed to raise her glass, Peter announced to all that her time had run out.
He was threatening to divorce Catherine, send her to a nunnery, and leave her without anything. And so Catherine realized that the moment had come also for her to act.
The next night, Catherine's lover, Gregory Orlov, his brothers, and their fellow guardsmen led a coup to save Catherine and Russia. They deposed Peter with ease. But for the hapless ex-Tsar, the worst was still to come.
If you are an empress, the only good ex-emperor is a dead ex-emperor.
To keep Catherine's hands clean, Orlov and his brothers dragged Peter out of St. Petersburg. The conspirators' hatred soon got out of hand. A letter to Catherine from Orlov broke the news. The monster was dead. In July of 1762, Peter III, the Tsar of Russia, suffered an unfortunate, fatal accident. He collided with the ambitions of his wife, Catherine the Great.
The official word was that he had died of hemorrhoids, an odd disease to pick, but nonetheless, after he was killed, it became even more important that she establish that she was the savior of Russia and that he was going to crucify Russia.
To depose an unpopular ruler was one thing, but for a German princess to claim the Tsar's crown, Catherine would have to transform herself and the Russian nation.
How did Catherine have the chutzpah to think that she could rule? The hubris, indeed. Well, again, I think she knew she had the talent and she had the backing, and she had become Russian.
She certainly saw herself as legitimate, that she was the competent person, that she was devoted to Russia and Russia's interests, and that she saved Russia from disaster.
For more than half her life, Catherine had forged allies and studied the path to power. Like her model, the Empress Elizabeth, Catherine seized the throne with a coup. Then, to consecrate her authority, she headed to the cathedrals of the Kremlin to be crowned.
She immediately orchestrated a brilliant coronation in which she was celebrated as elected by the people. And then she embarked upon a program of reform. That was how you demonstrated your fitness for the throne after Peter the Great. You reformed. You became a reforming Tsar.
At 33 years old, a German princess had claimed the authority of the Russian emperor. The Empress Catherine the Great's lust for knowledge and power would prove to be the stuff of legend and the engine of history. She filled the rooms of St. Petersburg's palaces with art by the great masters, turning her Hermitage into the world's greatest museum. She collected admirers like she stockpiled art, powerful friends and devoted lovers, men she used to cement her hold on power and ease the burdens of imperial rule. Her hunger for land expanded the empire in almost every direction. From Eastern Europe to Alaska and America's Pacific Northwest, Catherine reigned supreme. Above all, she pursued reform. She promoted local government. She chartered schools and universities. She encouraged Russia's elites to challenge tradition. And in so doing, lit the fuse for revolutionary change in Russia.
The entire Russian elite felt as though they were having a honeymoon period with her because they discovered that finally they had an empress who spoke the same language as they did, the language of the Enlightenment, who had the same goals as they did, namely to make Russia a state based on law, not based on personal rule, and they applauded this empress of theirs.
Catherine seized the Russian throne in 1762, in the Age of Enlightenment. Philosophers and writers heralded the rights of man and the belief that reason could perfect human society. Catherine saw herself as a priestess of the liberal movement.
Liberty, the soul of everything. Without you, all is dead.
Yet the rights of man confronted the Empress Catherine with a dangerous paradox. For in Russia, where the economy was built on the slave labor of the serfs, human rights was an explosive ideal.
It's precisely because you have this enormous gap between sections of educated society and the realities of Russian life, and indeed the values and the mentality of the bulk of the peasant population, that Russia becomes increasingly difficult to govern.
The plight of Russia's serfs gnawed at Catherine's high ideals. Still, the Empress knew her crown depended on the loyalty of the nobility. To free the serfs would undermine the nobles and her throne. But in villages along the Volga, the peasants took liberation into their own hands. In 1773, a Cossack and army deserter, Emelian Pugachev, proclaimed himself to be Catherine's dead husband, Tsar Peter III. He called on the masses to overthrow the tyrant queen.
Pugachev set up a court and started issuing edicts, quite of a revolutionary nature. Namely, let us exterminate the officials and the landlords, let us end taxation and end military equipment, free the serfs, and divide up the land. So this was quite a revolutionary and attractive to many parts of the population.
For over a year, rebellion gripped the Volga River basin. The rebels murdered hated landowners and sacked their homes. But even as they swelled to over 100,000 men, Pugachev's forces would prove no match for Catherine's army. In 1774, the pretender was captured, brought to court in an iron cage, interrogated, and executed. His peasant revolt died with him. The fate of Russia's working poor would haunt the empire to its death. But for Catherine, human rights ended where they threatened her absolute rule.
It's been said by people who were in her entourage that she developed a fear of the common people and a conviction that it was much too early to free the serfs.
Like Tsar Peter the Great, Catherine was committed to reform, but survival came first. And for a Russian ruler, survival often depended on raw power, conquest, and expansion.
There's a very clear logic in Russia's expansion, just as there's also a political logic. I mean, the ruling class of Russia is a landowning aristocratic class. Territorial expansion brings them enormous benefits. The state itself is a sort of deal between the Tsar and the aristocracy, and both of them gain tremendously from expansion.
Catherine knew that one territorial goal had always tantalized the Tsars: to expand Russia to the shores of the Black Sea. Seizing the Black Sea coast from the Ottoman Empire would become the Tsarina's enduring obsession. In 1768, Catherine's armies marched into years of warfare with the Ottoman Turks and their allies. The struggle would shape much of Catherine's reign and her personal life.
Obviously, she could not be a general in the field, but she paid a lot of attention to the armed forces, made sure they were loyal to her. She gave them all sorts of favors.
One victorious commander in the Turkish campaigns won special favor from the Empress, Grigory Alexandrovich Potyomkin. As the Turks gave way in the south, Potyomkin gained sway in the court. Soon, his position eclipsed old favorites like Grigory Orlov.
Potemkin was tall, one-eyed, he lost an eye, greasy, brutish, all qualities that repulsed most women, but to Catherine, he was just the end. And through satisfying her, he gained a lot of power in the kingdom.
The moody, battle-scarred warrior became the Empress's closest advisor and the great love of her life. He was awarded chambers in the Winter Palace, and for years he could be seen roaming the halls at night.
From all sources, it appears that they had a very passionate affair, and they may have been secretly married. And here you have an example, once again, of Catherine using someone who grew into becoming a great statesman, one of the great statesmen in all of Russian history.
Catherine enlisted Potyomkin in her plan to dismember the ailing Ottoman Empire. The critical first step: conquer the strategic Black Sea peninsula, the Crimea. The Crimea dominated the Black Sea. Control of the peninsula would give Russia a commanding southern stronghold. For years, Potemkin guided Catherine's assault on the Crimea. In 1784, Russia would officially take control of the peninsula. To show her gratitude, the Empress anointed Potemkin Prince of Crimea. After 20 years on the throne, the Empress Catherine had realized the age-old dream of the Tsars. Russia had seized the Crimea and become a leading Black Sea power. To commemorate her reign, Catherine unveiled a monument to Peter the Great in the heart of St. Petersburg. The magnificent bronze horseman became a symbol of her legitimacy, one more link in the chain between a German princess and the dynasty of the Romanovs.
She wanted to make clear to them that she was going to follow the kinds of policies that Peter the Great had, that Russia was going to be great again. And she actually was offered the title of the Great in the first year of her reign, and she rejected and said, "This is absurd. This is only something that posterity can decide."
Catherine now considered herself truly Russian. Once, when doctors came to bleed the Empress, she joked that she hoped they would drain the last drop of her German blood. In the end, Catherine's legacy would be shaped by blood. Blood in the streets of Paris, over 1,000 miles away. The blood of the French Revolution. The Empress Catherine of Russia entered the last decade of the 18th century as the most powerful woman on earth. Her dominion stretched from Poland to Alaska. She ruled nearly 30 million nobles, commoners, and serfs with a firm hand and firm faith in progress and reform.
Catherine introduced public participation in government in a way that had never occurred before in Russian history, and thereby laid the foundations for what is called today a civil society. She is one of the greatest monarchs of the 18th century, one of the greatest monarchs in Russia, and perhaps one of the greatest monarchs of all time.
But the almighty Empress was powerless to affect history a continent away. And in the late 18th century, Russia's destiny was being shaped in the streets of Paris. 1793, revolutionary terror claimed the life of Louis XVI, King of France. For Catherine, his execution was a crime against God's will.
She saw Louis XVI beheaded, and she started doubting the Enlightenment ideals that may have resulted in all of this. So she became somewhat panicked by the French Revolution.
In 1796, the revolution flooded out of France as the army of the French Republic marched into Italy, led by a brilliant young commander. Napoleon Bonaparte had made his entrance on the grand stage of history. Now 67 years old, Catherine knew her own exit from history was not far off. She was adamant that her empire would continue to be led not by a populist mob, but by her own flesh and blood. By law, Catherine could choose whom she pleased as heir to her throne, and the Tsarevich, Paul, the son she had borne for her murdered husband Peter, was not necessarily first choice.
Catherine was afraid of Paul. She saw qualities in him, dangerous qualities. He was a cruel, unstable, dangerous person. And he asked a lot of questions about what had happened to his father and why was his mother on the throne. And that made him dangerous to Catherine.
Unwelcomed and uncomfortable in his mother's court, the Tsarevich devoted his life to drilling and re-drilling his Prussian-style battalions. In Catherine's eyes, the thing Paul did best was to breed children, particularly his firstborn, the Grand Duke Alexander.
Alexander had a difficult, interesting childhood and adolescence. He was in a sense stuck between his grandmother, the Empress Catherine, and his father. Alexander more or less had to be everything to both of them, pretending that he sympathised with both sides. And that bred in him a certain caution, a certain tendency always to be charming to everyone, to make everybody believe that he agreed with them.
Catherine had the finest liberal scholars tutor Alexander in Enlightenment ideals. His father, Paul, taught him to be a military drill master. As Catherine faced mortality, the question of her successor, her son or her grandson, loomed large. November 5th, 1796. The aging empress was paralyzed by a stroke. The following night, the German princess who had ruled the Russian Empire for 34 years was dead. Some historians claim that her son Paul searched Catherine's chambers before the body was cold and burned any papers that threatened his right to be crowned. Tsar Paul I wasted no time taking revenge on his mother.
He dug out the corpse of his father, Peter III, put him in a coffin, and placed him right next to her at the funeral so that they would be eternally together, which he just thought was a divine joke.
For 71 years, women had ruled Russia. Paul had chafed under his mother's rule. After her death, he rushed out a decree that only the males of the Romanov line were fit to wear the Russian crown.
He had been eager to have power for more than 20 years, and I think that's part of the reason that he made such a mess of things, because he was a man in a hurry. He always felt that he didn't have much time left, so he had to do everything overnight.
Paul reversed policies without reason. Anxious nobles feared chaos.
This guy directed every element of Russian life, from the way people dressed to what they were allowed to do at a funeral or a wedding.
Rumors of a coup to put Alexander on the throne began almost with Paul's coronation.
Alexander was approached by many members of Russia's elite about the need to get rid of his father, and Alexander himself recognized that his father was proving to be quite erratic, quite capricious.
Paul became convinced he was a target for assassination. Behind a moat ringed with sentries, he built a palace like a fortress. He moved in before the plaster was dry and placed his son Alexander under house arrest. Within days, the coup plotters were on the move. On the night of March 11th, 1801, influential men from the inner circle at court swept past the guards at Paul's palace fortress. The conspirators found the Tsar hiding in his bedroom. The scuffle that followed turned into a deadly brawl. For a third consecutive generation, one Romanov had snatched the crown from another. But his father's murder left the new Tsar, 23-year-old Alexander Pavlovich, racked with guilt.
I'm sure they told Alexander that Paul would simply be pushed aside, and I'm sure Alexander persuaded himself that that would be the case. But it wasn't realistic. You couldn't have a retired Tsar sitting in some palace on the outskirts of Petersburg waiting for the next coup against his son in order to be restored. It was never viable.
Though Alexander had no part in the coup, he did nothing to stop it. Similar indecision and contradictions would cloud Alexander's reign. Inspired by liberal ideals, the new Tsar flirted with granting Russia a constitution, but he would never follow through.
Under Alexander I, it was difficult to know in what direction Russia would go. He couldn't make that decision, that momentous, heroic decision to oversee the devolution of his own power.
As Alexander wavered about the future of Russia, a continent away, a bold upstart declared himself Emperor of France and plunged ahead with plans to remake all of Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte.
You could not find two more different men than Napoleon and Alexander I. Napoleon was completely filled with self-confidence. He felt called upon to be the master of the universe, never doubting his genius, and never doubting his flair, never doubting his strategy. Whereas Alexander I seems to have been born confused and not knowing exactly what direction he wants to take, and so he goes off in all these various directions.
In 1807, Napoleon would force Alexander to sign a treaty of friendship, but the Tsar of Russia and the self-made Emperor of France were fated to wind up bitter enemies in a struggle for the fate of Europe.
As the French destroy the two great intermediary powers, Prussia and Austria, Russia is faced with a big dilemma. Because obviously, if Napoleon dominates the whole of Europe from the Atlantic to the Russian border, he controls such immense resources that he's basically going to be able to make Russia do whatever he wants.
In 1811, Alexander finally took a stand. Defying Napoleon's grand ambitions, he declared allegiance with England and prepared for all-out war with France. Napoleon answered in force. Close to 500,000 fighting men, the largest army in European history, marched on Moscow. In the face of overwhelming forces, the Tsars' commanders turned to the strategy that had served Russia for centuries: fall back and harass the invaders as they struggled across the vast motherland. All summer long, Napoleon marched deeper and deeper into Russia. He looked for a decisive battle, but found only an empty and unwelcoming land. On the morning of September 7th, 1812, one day's ride from Moscow, Napoleon finally found what he was looking for. 120,000 Russian soldiers, Alexander's imperial army, ready to fight to the death for the fields of Borodino. Borodino, September 7th, 1812. The armies of two great empires attacked and counterattacked. The bloodbath began at dawn and went on long past dark. For over a decade, Napoleon Bonaparte had seemed invincible as he marched across Europe. Tsar Alexander's Russian armies were the last obstacle to continental dominance.
For Napoleon to win in 1812, he had to destroy the Russian army, because otherwise they would just go on retreating in front of him, and in the end, his own line of supply would become so immense that his army would disintegrate.
75,000 men would die that day. Both sides would claim victory. Still, the death toll convinced the Russian generals to leave the field and the city of Moscow to Napoleon.
The losses on both sides were enormous, and it was very clear to the French soldiers and generals that the Russian army's will to fight was by no means exhausted.
For weeks, Napoleon waited for Alexander to concede defeat. Then the Russians set fire to his prize, Moscow. More than half the city burned to the ground. To the Russian people, it was a sacrilege. For Napoleon, it was a disaster.
The main impression was horror, that having marched all this way and seized Moscow, he was actually no closer to achieving his goal. Because sitting in Moscow through the winter, even if the city hadn't been destroyed, was impossible.
Napoleon's order to retreat came too late. The Russian winter came early and hard. The French were 1,500 miles from home, with little to eat and no shelter from the storm. Then, the Emperor Alexander called on the Russian people to annihilate the enemy. Russians of every class rose in fury and fell on the invaders.
Napoleon's mark of invincibility had been taken away from him. I mean, after all, he lost well over 500,000 men in that campaign.
The losses were immense, huge, and in some ways the losses of the horses were even more important than the losses of the men, because even after losing 500,000 men in Russia, which was simply unprecedented in European history, what he couldn't do was make up for the loss of trained cavalry and trained artillery. And in that sense, the retreat was vastly important, because the French cavalry was virtually wiped out.
Napoleon had entered Russia with the largest army in European history. By the time they reached the Polish border, his Grande Armée had been reduced to barely 25,000. For Alexander, the burning of Moscow had sparked a mystical religious conversion. The born-again Orthodox Tsar now embarked on a holy crusade to eliminate Bonaparte and return the capitals of Europe to their rightful monarchs.
Alexander feels that God has rewarded him for his strength and for his renewed Christian faith by giving him Napoleon, you know, on a plate, if you like, defeating the conqueror of Europe.
Armies from Prussia and Austria joined the crusade. In 1814, with the Tsar himself in command, the Allied forces swept across Europe to the gates of Paris. For 25 years, France had endured revolution and endless war. Paris was ready for an end to chaos. Alexander entered Paris in triumph.
This is actually the culmination of the 18th century in Russia. For the entire 18th century, Russia had been drawing itself closer and closer to Europe, trying to prove that it was an equal partner in the family of Europe. And now, here was the Russian Tsar leading the Allied troops from all of Europe to unseat the evil usurper.
But in the cradle of the revolution, Russia's elite guardsmen saw the power of liberal politics in action.
The ideas that these Russian soldiers picked up were ideas of a constitutional monarchy, not an absolutist monarchy. The idea that civil and political rights was something that all people should enjoy. The idea that equality before the law should be, and indeed a regime based on rule by law, should be the foundation for any modern state.
On their return to Russia, many young officers who had ridden with Alexander into Paris remained inflamed with ideas of liberty and reform. They met in secret and plotted the unthinkable, a constitution for absolutist Tsarist Russia. The would-be revolutionaries had no confidence the Tsar would lead the way. Alexander had abandoned liberal ideas too often before. Tsar Alexander, though well aware of the rising fever for reform, instead withdrew into religious mysticism. In 1825, by the shores of the Black Sea, the emperor died. Childless himself, the Tsar had left the throne to his younger brother, Nicholas.
Nicholas was 19 years Alexander's junior. So while Alexander I was a child of the Enlightenment, Nicholas I was not. Nicholas I grew up in an atmosphere of hostility to revolution and of breaking revolution wherever one might spot it.
But the succession from Alexander to Nicholas had been a strictly kept secret. The Tsar-to-be hesitated to take the throne.
None of this had been publicly established, so there was a sort of interregnum of a few days, and the conspirators took advantage of this to try to achieve the overthrow of the absolute monarchy.
With the succession in turmoil, the radicals knew they might never have a better chance. December 14, 1825. Nicholas ordered Russia's elite to swear allegiance to his reign. Rebel officers, the Decembrists, gathered in St. Petersburg's Senate Square. They began to chant for a new form of rule, a constitution. By noon, 700 rebels waited in the square. Troops loyal to Nicholas surrounded them. Then the Tsar-to-be rode into view. Absolute rule or a constitution? For a moment, Russia's fate hung in the balance. Then Nicholas opened fire. The Decembrist rebellion and the dream of sweeping political change collapsed in chaos. The Tsar still reigned supreme. Nicholas I had preserved the Romanov dynasty. The Russian Empire was now acknowledged as the most powerful nation on earth. But 100 years of revolution had just begun.